Where is everyone joining from, and why is this conversation today important to you? So our conversation about the second wave of COVID-19 and how to prepare your customers and employees. And just quickly to introduce myself, so my name is Brittany Hobbs. I'm the head of research for a company called PH1 Research. We're also the main organizer for this event. So just to get us quickly started, so you're here for customer experience challenges. We do have a couple more webinars that are coming up. We've seen that quite a number of you have actually already registered for multiple events, which is really, really exciting to us. But just to let you know as well, the other events that are coming up is next week. We have an event about how COVID is changing education, particularly higher education, and really addressing the CX and employee experience challenges around education. On June 3rd, we're going to be talking about tourism and hospitality and how that industry needs to adapt to the changing needs of visitors. And then on June 17th, we're going to be talking about how organizations become adaptive and resilient in a time of crisis. So really looking at how do we come out of this and where do we go from there. We also, just so you know, we haven't had a date scheduled for it yet, but how can we look at helping charities meet the needs of donors in a time of crisis as well? And oh, thank you. So we have people from Bellingham, Washington, Minnesota, someone from a nonprofit community developmental financial institution based in Chicago. Great. So we've got a number of American people representing here, which is fabulous. And Alex from Sunshine Coast. Hi. Perfect. So excited to see more people answering there. Just to let everyone know as well, and we'll talk about this a little bit at the end today, is we are also going to be offering on Fridays after each of these events a working session. So an opportunity for a small group of people, limited capacity, to come together and talk about some of the things that we heard, really engage each other from an attendee perspective, and really try and help sort out some of these questions and answers as well as a group. Like I said, I'm from a company called PH1 Research. We are the organizing sponsor. We are a customer experience consulting and service design firm. So we really specialize in things like doing CX audits and strategies, persona development and journey mapping, service blueprints and discovery research. So if you do want to learn a little bit more about what we do, you can go to ph1.ca, or you can reach out to myself or Arpi, who is going to be speaking in a couple of minutes. And we'd be happy to chat with you about customer experience, employee experience, and how to learn a little bit more about that and getting through this time. Oh, and quickly before we get on, I also want to introduce Thomas from Qualtrics. So Qualtrics is very kindly sponsoring our events as well, and he's going to take you through a little bit about what they do and especially about what they're offering during this time to really help organizations of any size learn more about their customers and employees.
Thank you, Brittany. I appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. And I will be very quick and I will be brief because I don't want to delay us getting into the content and the engagement that we have planned today. It's going to be fantastic. I would just like to say thank you to the PH1 organization for allowing Qualtrics to be a part of something like this. And for those of you who do not know who Qualtrics is, I will take the next minute or so to give you a quick little rundown. And if there is any questions or if there are any things that my organization, any of my teammates can do for any of you, please don't hesitate to reach out, okay? And so very quickly, who Qualtrics is, we are the leading experience management organization in the world today. And what we essentially do is enable organizations to gather feedback across the 4 major pillars of their organization. And as you can see here, these are the different values and business outcomes that are typically driven within each of these different pillars. You see a circle here because it is one integrated and connected piece of technology that Qualtrics enables our customers to leverage. As I've mentioned, it comes down to our 4 pillars: customer, product, employee, and brand experience. And when you think of a way in which an organization will be able to interact with the different audiences as it relates to each of these different pillars, we need to be personal. We need to change the way in which we're communicating and gathering that feedback. And so what we do is we allow organizations to take the feedback, which we are classifying as your operational data, as your experience data, and you combine that with the operational data that all of your organizations are so rich with. And we have 3 different principles here. We first listen, We collect and converse with our audiences. We then understand. We analyze and make decisions, and now we begin acting. We act and we improve. And what we are doing in this time right now, the unprecedented times that we have in the world today, are to help organizations with COVID-19 crisis. I'm proud to say all of these solutions that you see here are on the screen, are a fingertip away for all of you individuals to access at no additional charge. And we have services to enable your organizations if the resources don't exist. Qualtrics has done this as a response to COVID-19 because this is what the world needs, and we're happy to help. I thank you all for your time. If there are any questions, please let me know. But Brittany and RP, it's been a pleasure. Thank you guys. Looking forward to the event.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Thomas. And now I'm going to pass it over to RP from the PH1 team to talk us through a little bit about why this topic and why this is important to us and as an industry.
Right. Can you enable my video, Brett?
Yes.
Or actually, I can do that. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is a difficult conversation to have. It's not a topic we want to be discussing. However, several factors make this a conversation that every business leader really should be having right now. Number one is that pandemics occur in multiple waves. There are many precedents from this for us. Looking back as far as the 1918 pandemic, even as closely as SARS, and even today in recent news, when you look in Korea and China, there are resurgences that happen regularly, whether they're considered waves or simply just reincidents. That's a separate piece from this conversation. But nonetheless, even when numbers are going down, as is point 2 here, cases of COVID-19 are still increasing in many regions, and in many of those places where they have been dropping, the incidences do come back. So this is a pressing piece for us to consider as we enter this conversation. Now, beneath that really is this idea that a vaccine is the only way for us to escape this. We may have hoped going into this that it'll just end, but the reality is, as is becoming more and more apparent, that a vaccine is realistically the only way that we can return to that sense of normal that we had before. There's a lot of thoughts, a variety of different perspectives on how that will come to be, but we'll see what happens. And then the other piece is that ultimately the economic impact has been significant and many jurisdictions are beginning to open things up. The only certainty in the near future is that the survival organizations and industries will depend on building trust and confidence. And in this crisis, it will be much easier to lose trust than build back that trust because your customers have never been through this before, and neither have your employees. The last unfortunate reality check is that leadership generally were not prepared for this crisis. In a study conducted by our team at PH1 Research, comparing March and April, we found quite quickly that leadership in March really were not considering this a crisis. They were not preparing for it. When we looked at it in April, the impact had hit them significantly. Layoffs were something that were not discussed in March, and in April they were quite significant. All that being said, with the pandemic extending, as we do see it happening from potentially years, foresight will be critical to protecting customers and employees. So looking at today's agenda, in the agenda, we'll be looking at the ongoing crisis from several lenses. First, we'll look at how a prolonged crisis can expand inequity and tensions, particularly over generational lines. And then our panel will explore how we can protect our employees and customers. Throughout today, please make sure to use the QA feature to ask questions about the presentation and the panel. So now I'm happy to welcome Ann Boysen. She is a futurist with a particular interest in generational change. Since 2011, she's operated the blog and consulting business After the Millennials, which focuses on viewing the future through the lens of a generation who only recollects life in the 21st century. Anne has worked with a number of businesses in several industries, including Google, and has appeared on various media and podcasts, and that's how we met. She's a popular keynote speaker and has brought insights and challenged assumptions for audiences in several countries, and received her master's in strategic foresight at the University of Houston, and is a graduate of business analytics from Penn State, and she's also a professor. Thank you, Anne.
All right, and are you able to I've just unmuted you, but are you able to get your video working?
For some reason, it won't start my video. The host is says that the host has stopped the video.
Oh,
okay. Again.
There, I think. There we go. Perfect.
Okay, there we go. Okay. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Yes, I'm here to not try to share too much about specific insights on the customer experience or employee experience. I have focused more on a different part of that. I sometimes get called in to weigh in on generational issues and sort of what you see, the type of scenarios that we can see in the future based on that. So I look forward to the panel discussion following. I'm going to try to give you sort of a baseline, the generational baseline of where we are today and where we might go in the near future if this pandemic continues on or sort of hit a second wave. Let me see, am I sharing my screen now? I'm not sure that I am.
No, you're not yet.
No, okay. So let's see. So here we go. Okay, sorry about that. So let me put this in presenter mode. So, all right. So yeah, a little bit about me. I don't know exactly when I started focusing on generational aspect. I did work in. I did come from a market research type of background, and then I have a background in educational background in foresight. And at some point, I realized that if I am to really understand social change, I need to look in more deeply into generations and generational change. Because it's very often that when you have many people who are going through a life stage at the same time that you really see this big momentous shift. If you go on your search engine and you type in generation or generational differences, very often you will get a sort of a one-dimensional view of how we are different. You get sort of a kind of reductionist prototype of how this generation is and how that generation is. And sometimes it is, the narrative is shaped as sort of a fight, like a generational battle, as if as if the interest of one generation is always at the sacrifice of another one. And that helps headlines, especially clickbait, but I think there are more fruitful and more productive ways of looking at generational differences. And I try to remind myself of this quote from Anna Karenina, which very early in his book, Tolstoy wrote that all happy families are alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own different ways. So meaning that if everything's fine and dandy, you don't have the presence of those factors that can make you unhappy. But whenever something happens that is cause for unhappiness, though that's a much wider spectrum to cover. So there's more heterogeneity among unhappy families. And I think we can see the same in generations. So if you have an event that happens to everyone at the same time, it will be perceived differently based on where you are in your life phase. So instead of viewing, for example, COVID-19 as this event that is going to have winners and losers based on generational fault lines, I think it's more important to see that we're going to react differently based on where we are in our life phase. So if you look at older generations, they are more at the direct receiving end of the health threat. They are perceiving this, they're having this health risk. The more secondary effect is more severe for younger generations. I just think that's important to keep in mind. Now, when I have talked to Generation Zers and done several surveys in the past, there's a lot of questions these days, and if we're ever going to go back to normal. But the thing is, this generation does not perceive normal. They have not perceived that they have grown up in anything that is normal. The system that they are perceiving is very different from how they perceive reality in their future. So I think that it's easy to forget that the other crisis that was leading up before COVID was this perception that we have perhaps 10 years to salvage our Earth, and otherwise, if we don't do that, there's no future. So this young generation is very used to addressing the fact that we have a system that is not working. So this COVID-19 is just another straw on the camel's back in many ways. And it gives us an opportunity to make those corrections that we really should have done long ago. And how do young people, how do they approach systems that are not working? Well, they want to reset it, right? This is the 5-second generation. They don't have time to look through codes and figure out where the bug is. They just decide, okay, it's not working, let's try afresh. That is what this crisis is representing to us. It's representing an opportunity to make a big change. Another factor that I think is very important to keep an eye on during this time is mental health. Very often when we talk about Generation Z and how they're perceiving or how mental health problems are affecting them, we very often look for individualized explanatory variables, such as screens or the fact that they have sensibilities, that they're snowflakes, maybe that their parents didn't raise them well. So very quickly, we've had this discussion of mental health and Generation Z and the fact that they have growing problems with mental health as a personalized problem. It's instead of viewing it as maybe a gauge of something that is not working. And again, I think that, you know, if you're young today and you're perceiving that the world is going off the hinge, or if you can't go to school without fearing that somebody's going to bring an AR-15, these are actually the statistics. These are the real causes of mental health problems in Generation Z. Now, I'm bringing this up because Jean Twenge, who's a professor at University of California in San Diego, she did some interesting numbers recently, and she found that during this COVID-19 crisis, mental health has significantly. Now, she does take numbers and compare it with 2018 numbers. So I don't think that COVID-19 is the only thing that explains the increase in mental health problems, but it's certainly this whole combination of wicked problems is something that is going to weigh on Generation Z for a long time. So we're going to unpack this a little bit. We should probably look at the various different aspects and kind of look at the baseline how did this generation fare socially, economically, technologically, and politically before this crisis, what's happening now, and how can we foresee this, how can we foresee this in the future? And, you know, this is not the type of digital living that this generation had looked forward to. So one thing I do believe is that if there is one generation of youth that can handle a social distancing crisis where you are relying on digital communication, it is this generation. And there's been a lot of focus on that for a long time. They've been abandoning the shopping malls and the traditional venues where young people meet and hang out with each other. And more of that social interaction has started to take place online instead. That does not necessarily mean that this is a choice. It's more a convenience. Having a graduation party on Zoom, like we are having a meeting now, is a poor replacement for having it in person. Something like 47% of Gen Zers are reporting an increased sense of loneliness during this time. They already had a very high level of loneliness. So this is just kind of, you see the statistics spike with this pandemic and the effects of this pandemic. But there are some upsides, because some of the variables that are causing them to feel stress and mental health issues to begin with are actually now pausing. It's being put on a great pause. So academic pressure has been a great contributor to mental health problems, and so has overscheduled activities for younger children. I took this picture when I was walking around in my neighborhood, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen the same, that suddenly chalk art on the pavement has come back. And I haven't seen this since I was young. And I think that is, again, because we have moved into a society where young people have not had the chance to really be bored at home, to do something else, to go outside in their neighborhood. They're being overscheduled. They're being on their screens. So this is an opportunity to explore some of those other aspects of what it means to be young. It's definitely, the net effect is not good, but I think I really am a believer in looking for the silver linings, and this is possibly one of them. Technologically, I don't know if we're going to see sort of like that the Zoomers are going to embrace this 100%, this new way of working, where you trade the convenience of going to a physical job to just sit at home. Again, a lot of surveys are showing that they do prefer face-to-face. There's a big myth out there that young people are all digital and they don't want to hang out with other people anymore. That's not necessarily the case. They do prefer to be face-to-face, more so than millennials, actually. And this is what I think means to be digital native. When you are native to a culture, it does not mean that you embrace every single aspect of it. It does not mean that you are uncritical to it. It means that you have much better knowledge of it. And when you grew up as a digital native, you see both the pros and cons with working from home, studying from home, things of that nature. So I don't think that we can just sort of hang all our worries on, oh, this is a digital generation, they'll do fine anyway. I don't think so. However, I do expect that when we gradually phase back into society, if we have sort of like a risk stratified re-entrance into the economy, this will be the generation that will have the fewest issues with using things like COVID tracker apps on their phones. We see that in a lot of research, that they have more, in spite of the generally low trusts in companies and in governments, we see that they do tend to trust tech companies when there's a lot of explanations on how this is being done. And there are several layers with encryption and several reasons to believe that the private data that these trackers are going to harbor or collect are not going to be misused, and that they will be erased. Again, it's the Snapchat generation. They know that digital data can disappear if you want it to. And I also think that there's another element here, and that is I'm seeing a greater ability to appreciate negative externalities, positive and negative externalities. So we're moving a little bit away from, we've had growing individualism for a long time, where individual rights and privacy and things of that nature have been at the forefront, to a generation that is more willing to consider sort of the public health aspect, the importance of making sure that everybody's taken care of, even if that means some personal sacrifice. Economically, obviously, this is a hard hit for this youngest generation. Any generation that graduates during a recession is, they found that I think it takes about 10 years for a generation to recover from that. Millennials, a lot of millennials obviously came out with that experience during the last recession, and are still struggling catching up. That being said, I think it's very important that we don't frame the economic hardships that come from something like this as a generational issue. Again, I think it's very important that we view people in where they are in their life stage, and that there are sacrifices. It's just that it's experienced differently. Obviously, recessions happen about every 7 years, so every generation has had a cohort that graduated during a time of recession. That being said, we have enormous income inequality to begin with, so the landscape, the economic landscape, is much more difficult now. And if we go into a much more prolonged recovery, possibly even a depression, we will see some lifelong effects of this. It doesn't get any better by the fact that the most exposed either to the pathogen itself or to unemployment due to the risk associated with the job is asymmetrically carried by the younger people. I took some data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where I tried to separate the data into work that could be done from home, which is possible, might not be done from home today, but it is possible to do from home. And I looked at the jobs where you have to go somewhere, maybe to a lab or to a nuclear plant, or where you have, in order to do your job, but you don't necessarily have to expose yourself to the risk of other people. And then you have these jobs that essentially are, the whole job is to interact with other people. And then I found this very clear age difference, where the more protected you can be, the more abilities you have to work from home and shelter yourself from other people and from the risks, the older you tend to be. Politically, I think that this is an interesting juncture in time, because at least here in the US, there was another sense of loss on part of this generation who really wanted, again, they wanted to change the system. They did not believe in the system we already had. And they expressed that through their support of politicians like Bernie Sanders. And one of the phenomenon that are kind of interesting in the aftermath of this, or the way that we're coping with this pandemic, is that we are now having to institute some of the very same policies that this younger generation has been rallying around, like a universal basic income, decentralized systems that are not so fragile to this very globalized supply chains, public health care, the dangers of exploiting wildlife, believing that viruses come from wildlife, and the importance of going more over to a plant-based local diet. And we have proven that the very steps that we refused to take a year ago, when we were talking about having to make some sacrifices today to avoid the effects of climate change, we have proven that we can do it, because right now there's a lot of aircrafts that are not moving. They're not in the air right now. We have reduced our production. We have reduced CO2 emissions. And it's coming at a great cost. But again, if we really want to get our priorities straight, this is what this next generation is going to remind us of in the future, if we decide to sort of like go back to business as usual, as if this never happened. This is the reminder, this is the lesson. And that brings me to my next and last slide, where I foresee that we might have 4 different type of scenarios here. And they're along the dimensions of intergenerational conflict, and also the duration of the crisis, and how bad the crisis is. I do think that if we have a relatively short duration, if we're able to get back on our feet and go back to normal, we weren't supposed to use that word, but I'm using it. If we're able to get back to business as usual in a few months, we would continue to have this bickering between generations unless we manage to take a lesson from it. And that is that we will be constantly reminded that we did this for COVID, for that disease that is hurting older people, this disease that has an effect on older people. We're not doing for the young people, and to protect their health from the effects of climate change and other issues, and addressing these deeper systemic problems that young people are facing today. Again, if we see it as a lesson, I think that if we're just going to go through this for a few months, there'll be a lesson there, but we won't necessarily have enough time to really change our system. I do think that if we have, if we can manage to get some kind of collaboration between the generations and between different stakeholders, we could actually use this crisis as a catalyst to move us into a different and more sustainable way life or way of reorganizing our systems. Or we could go into complete stalemate, and that could possibly turn into sort of a tribal warfare, or where we don't really do any sort of mitigation. We don't want to do any sort of really major collaboration, but it's about who are the winners and who are the losers again, and that's not going to serve us very well. So that was my presentation, and I'm very excited to hear the more substantive discussion. I'm very happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Anne. This is really, really great. So we have one question from, oh my gosh, I'm going to butcher this so badly. Catriona McParland. She was asking about whether or not you think that the increase in mental health issues could be due to the fact that we as a society are more open to talking about it. So I don't know if you have a stance on that in like maybe 1 minute or less, and also if anyone has any other questions for Anne or for the panelists as we're talking, please do send them in the Q&A box as well. But Anne, maybe do you have a stance on that, whether you think it is the fact that we are more open to having mental health conversations, which is increasing those stats, or do you think it is more about what's going on in our society right now?
It is part of it, absolutely, but it does not explain everything, because suicide rates are up. If you just are willing to accept the fact that you have a mental diagnosis and you're more open about it, you don't go and kill yourself. And suicides among young people are up with 56% for the last 10 years.
Okay, so yeah, so there's a much bigger factor at play from a generational standpoint. All right. Well, thank you for answering that and for all of this. This is really insightful. And we're going to move on to the panel now. But again, if you have questions, and I believe you're able to stay kind of throughout. So, you know, at the end, if we have time, if we have additional questions for you, then we'll ask those kind of at the end as well. And yeah, so now I'm just going to quickly take over the screen. Let me see if I can. And I would like to introduce our panelists. So we have 4 panelists. So we have Amy Bucher, who you guys can all kind of turn your videos on if you'd like. So we've got Amy Bucher, PhD, is the Vice President of Behavior Change Design at MadPow. And I can't see myself, so I'm not sure if I'm still here, but basically if you can't hear me, if someone sends me a message, let me know. But basically her research interests include motivational design, patient and user engagement, happiness, how social relationships influence health and well-being, and cross-cultural behavior change strategies. Amy is also the author of the Rosenfeld Media book, Engage, Designing for Behavior Change. We also have Russ Rickey, PhD, who's the strategy director at Critical Mass. He's led creative teams in-house and for agencies delivering products for global brands, including AT&T, Blue Shield of California, Clorox, Coca-Cola, Disney, ESPN, Infinity, Kraft Foods, MTV, Nissan, SAP, and the United Way. During this crisis, he has worked extensively in healthcare to aid them with adapting. And then we've got Warren Anthony, who's a senior manager of advisory services at EY. Warren is a service design leader working with government and public agencies across Canada, working to improve experiences by combining our digital, physical, and social worlds. He's also a member of EY's Global Future Cities team, and in previous lives, he led the digital agency UX teams in London and Vancouver. So I'm just gonna stop my sharing now and just see, do we have everyone here? We do. And I'm just gonna kind of hide you for now if it lets me, so that yeah, there we go. And perfect, so we have everybody here. Thank you all for joining me. I'm gonna unmute you all as well. Let's see if it lets me do it. And then Warren, there we go. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you for joining this conversation. As we saw in Anne's presentation, the COVID crisis will have very long-lasting consequences that will not be equitably distributed. As much as some government officials want to promote that the crisis is nearly over, the risk of another wave of lockdowns and an economic shockwave is really high. We want to discuss how the risk of a second wave requires us to think differently about customers and employees. And I do want to say to people, we are not epidemiologists, we are strategists, but we're intent on helping you better prepare from a business standpoint. So, to start off, let's kind of gauge the room. I'd like to hear from each of you. Do you believe the worst of this crisis is already past? And if not, what about a potential second wave of impact concerns you most? So maybe let's start with, let's go with Amy.
Okay. So I don't unfortunately think that the worst has passed. I'm really concerned about the second wave. And the reason why, I live in the United States, I'm in Boston, Massachusetts. And I think in our country, we've probably had more chaos around information than some other places in the world. So that right away makes it difficult for people to change their behaviors. They're not sure what the right set of actions is, and they are looking to resources that they expect to be trustworthy and credible and not always finding that. So I think that has sub-optimized our response in this first wave. And then separate from that, in terms of the motivational dynamics, one of the things that makes people tick, that gets us engaged in an experience, is seeing the effects of our actions. So we're really hardwired to look to see, when we make waves in the world, where do they go? And many of the actions that we're asked to take to stop the contagion of COVID-19 are essentially doing nothing. So it's, staying at home, it's changing your routine and not taking action. And then the output of that similarly is not seeing an increase in infections. And that doesn't really work with the way that our brains are wired. So I think that what we're going to have going into the second wave is a lack of belief on the part of the public that these non-actions are effective, when in fact epidemiological science tells us that they are. So we really have to work with the mindsets that people are bringing into the situation and essentially convince them of something that they are programmed to believe is not true.
Great. All right. Warren, what about you?
I mean, I think I was thinking about this question. For me, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen next. I'm not sure anybody really does. I think there's so many sort of factors involved and so many sort of knock-on effects. I think it's very difficult to see what's going to happen next. And I'm certainly fearful for the future, but there's optimism there as well. Like Anne outlined in her presentation, the kind of different ways this could go. I mean, I think it's going to be interesting if this is the end of wave one is the end of it. There's still huge kind of ripple effects that are going to carry on for a while. I mean, we've seen massive unemployment like we've never seen before. Everyone's seen the graphs. So what happens there with the knock-on effects of that on rent, on tax collection, on government services, everything, just a huge impact. And then as Amy was just talking about the kind of the on the behavioral side of things, like we might return to work physically, but what about sort of cultural return to work and return to meaning and that kind of stuff? There was a tweet, or Twitter was talking yesterday about people being able to work from home forever, as if it was a fantastic thing. But obviously that is a huge challenge. So I think the challenges are only just beginning, whether there's a second wave of the disease or not. And if there is, I think, there is a potential that it could tip the scales of what governments and what businesses are able to do to support people. So I think that there was a tweet about COVID-19 driving digital transformation, and I thought it's actually driving a cultural transformation. And I think, we're just at the start of that. So trying to predict it is anyone's guess. Yeah.
All right, Russ, what do you think? What are you most concerned about a second wave?
I wish I'd come up with it, but I'm in agreement with Warren that predicting this is a bit like predicting the weather. In that the longer the forecast goes out, the less trust we have in it. I'm sure you insert wherever city you're in and you make fun of weather forecasters the farther they go out, because they're prediction models and they use the best available data. The one caveat here is our own behavior can have an impact on on this particular. And I'm kind of with Amy in terms of, I don't have a whole lot of trust in us behaving well in order to make the changes necessary or a short painful period to have longer term benefits. And I think we're seeing that. We're seeing that right now with, talking about a wave 2 possible. I'm not sure we're gonna get out of wave 1 in a lot of places as there's this desire to open up before flattening the curve, which is probably another phrase that we have heard far too much of, but that we're not even out of phase 1 or wave 1 in a lot of places. It has a lot to do with where you live, who your government is, and how dense, what the density is of the population around you. If you're in a rural place right now and a handful of people have maybe caught it or maybe nobody at all, then you have a very different perception on this. But in big cities, where most of us live these days, I think a wave 2 is pretty inevitable at this point, and so we best plan for it. And ultimately, that's it. I'm optimistic by nature, and so it's a bit of plan for the worst and hope for the best mentality as we go when we're talking about helping businesses out and helping our clients prepare for the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely going to be interesting considering that the rallying cry has really been about flatten the curve, but in reality, it's not about flattening the curve. It's about coming out the other end of the curve, and then what happens at that point. So by reopening just when we're flattening, I think we're sort of ensuring that we're more likely to have some additional things that happen.
And in lots of places, we're not even, and RB's graphs were really interesting at the start too, that never mind flattening anything, it's still going up in lots of places, and there's this desire to open businesses and redo things to get them back to where they were before, and that's going to have an impact.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like a big part of why we thought this conversation would be so interesting is because, we were conducting this research early on, and, we say early on, but, it's really like late March into the beginning of April. And it was pretty astounding to us how few organizations even thought that there would be an economic impact, let alone that they'd have to do layoffs. And now here we are, 10 million people on unemployment later. And, it just really goes to show how businesses underestimated and really underprepared for the crisis that first began, right? And now it took until April, let's say, 3 months after the World Health Organization declared it an emergency before people even began to take it seriously. And I would even say that there's some parts of the world where people weren't even taking it seriously until probably late in April, right? And so if we consider that, what signals do you think that businesses and public organizations should be paying attention to so that they avoid being blindsided again?
I felt like in North America, we've had the advantage of almost having a time portal because there are other countries who are ahead of us in their experience of COVID. And so one of the things that I personally have been paying a lot of attention to, kind of fascinated by, and I think that businesses and public organizations should also pay a lot of attention to, is what's happening in Asia and that part of the world parts of Europe where they seem to be ahead of us in terms of their experience, and looking at, what has happened to their curves based on the precautions that they've taken. So, I mean, we can see the difference between a country like New Zealand versus something like Italy and draw some lessons about what might we do in order to make our experience, our curve, look more like New Zealand. So I think those international stories are really valuable. And I feel very fortunate, but also a little guilty that I live in a part of the world where we are, kind of in the past, we have that glimpse of the future to learn from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Warren or Russ, what do you think that these organizations should be looking out for as markers?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in on this. So, I mean, the piece you said at the start around the organizations being kind of late to make changes or prepare or whatever. I think I saw a different side to that. So, I mean, I think EY, obviously, it's as a consultant, it's your job to be ahead of where your clients are going to be as much as possible. And so, I was trying to think about why EY was doing a really great job as far as sort of getting ahead of this. And so there was a lot of communication that went out really early. There was a lot of materials that were created that were based on really good data, and like Amy said, drawing on things that we'd learned as a global firm. There was material that we could get from all over the place, and most importantly, it was stuff that was actionable. And I think we're seeing more and more of that sort of available to everybody now, which is fantastic. And the other place I saw getting really ahead of it was the cities. So doing some work with some of the cities in the region up here, so Vancouver, Surrey, and others. Talking to some of those folks, they're on the front line. Like they've got people out there interacting with citizens on a regular basis, and obviously they need to take care of that workforce. And so they were prepared pretty early, and they were using the technology they had and doing as much as they could to kind of get things going early. So if I'm thinking about sort of recommendations and signals that people can be looking at, definitely learning from others, like Amy said, looking at those different kind of areas where you can get information from. So, sort of the risks that your workforce is going to face, the challenges that your kind of operational teams are going to be facing in getting the jobs done. Are they going to be in front of people? Are they going to be interacting with large groups? That kind of stuff. There's tons of data there that's available. The other piece is sort of listening and sharing information and kind of maybe looking at some different scenarios with people. So again, looking at Anne's talk about kind of thinking about what the possible futures might be. You don't have to just sort of stick with just one guess. You can plan from 4 or 5 scenarios and kind of work back from that, and look for the data that you're going to need to support that. I think that's that the data is there. It's kind of the pulling it together and getting insight from it that's the real challenge.
Yeah, so I think to kind of reframe it, because I think one of the things that's going to be really interesting is there's so many organizations that have been really, really hard hit by this, where they aren't fortunate of being able to just have their staff work from home and kind of carry on as though things are normal. And, we hear over and over again, especially from the consulting side of, well, we're just waiting to see what the health authorities say. We're just waiting to hear, what the word from above is. And so I think if I were to translate maybe what you said in terms of these organizations that maybe don't have the ability to have a ton of data, or to have been working through this time and really have to start almost from zero when they do get the go ahead to reopen, is that it will be really critical to do these kind of scenario planning and look at, of what we know now, here's kind of 5 different scenarios of how things might go, and look for what, kind of have stopgaps within that and say, here, like, look for certain things within each of those scenarios to know which of our scenarios we're going towards. Is that kind of?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's a really useful place to start. I mean, I think, maybe you might not have the data yourself as an organization, but probably there's the business associations, you can almost like go up the chain, almost look for your regional government, your city, your national governance. There's material there, there's data there that you can draw upon. So you use that to help plan.
Yeah, perfect. And so, I'm going to go to the next question. And sometimes you won't all get to answer each of them, but if you do you're like, I really want to answer this, just like put your hand up and I'll make sure that you do get heard. But my next question is, over the past few months, it's become really clear that you can't protect your customers. You can't create a good customer experience until your employees feel safe. So, what are some other lessons that you've learned over the last 2 months that would help businesses become a bit more anti-fragile? So really to come through and be less susceptible to this. So Russ, let's put it over to you.
Yeah, because I think my answer to the last question and answer to this one actually tie together. And I was going to talk earlier today at the University of Calgary, where they made the point of their expectations going forward is 5 years worth of innovation is going to happen in the next 18 months. And that a crisis like this forces us to be more innovative. My consulting with clients is obviously on digital transformation and creating digital experiences for both their clients, their customers, as well as their employees. And so I think the interesting thing is that for a while with digital transformation, we've been talking to companies about thinking like a tech company, becoming a tech company. And some very big brands have been successful at this more, but they're actually few and far between. You know, Starbucks transformed their business to be, they make coffee, but their app actually transformed their entire business. And there are other examples of that. I think the next thing that we're going to see is you're going to have to be a digital health company. And I think we're going to start seeing, like, the new title, you're going to see it a lot of larger organizations, and smaller businesses are going to have to figure out other ways to do this, is the chief medical officer, and somebody who's actually has the expertise and knowledge to help guide business decisions with health being a primary concern. And I would argue that that has to be a digital health officer, in that a lot of the answers we're going to find, even for businesses that we wouldn't think of as digital, are going to have a digital component to them. You know, an example would be something like a salon and reopening, and it's not a business that you would think of as a digital business, but I think you're going to see the day of walk-ins being eliminated. I think you're going to have to book online in advance. And do you have the tools in place to help manage your customer flow in a way that is convenient and easy for people to use, and they feel like they have trust in what you're doing? So much of this right now is we're going to, you know, the normal face-to-face elements of how we gain trust with customers is going to be under duress. And because of that, the tools that we have around from a digital component are going to have to help fill in that gap and create trust. And unfortunately, we know, you know, that there are a lot of gaps now. We're seeing, like, right now, there's been incredible pressure put on different brands and different companies and their digital tools, and decisions that they've been thinking about for a while suddenly have come to bear, that those that went forward with their digital transformation and went to improve their business processes using digital have come, you know, through this, not easy, but easier than those that had put off those decisions that didn't have those structures in place. And I think, you know, that all of us are going to have to start thinking about how we solve things with digital first, and truly embrace that, and not just claim that digital transformation is what we're working on. It's actually what we have to be, and get there quickly.
Yeah, and then you think that in terms of, like, the employee trust side of things too, like, do you think that it will be because there will be additional benefits to the employees with that, or because it will create a different dynamic with customers?
I think their first trust is health and safety. Like, you want to know that, you know, that somebody's not walking in off the street and is not being, you know, if you can start vetting that you're not, you know, that there is always the pressure to take in business as you get it, particularly if you're a smaller business. And I think we understand those pressures, and that, and particularly if you're going through right now where you've been closed for weeks, that you don't want to turn people away. But if you can manage that flow in and have some notion of sense and order around it, and prepare people for what they're to expect when they come in before they get there, set them up to be successful. Your employees will have trust in you as well, and then trust is gonna be hard to earn right now. But if you fail at that trust, I think it's going to be cataclysmic for your business. Like, there will be no forgiveness going forward here if you become a source.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting your stance on the idea of having a chief medical officer in just kind of an average or everyday business as well, that the kind of blurring of the lines between what health and wellness and mental health can mean for an organization, and how that needs to become such a high priority to really dedicate employees to that as well.
Could I just add a different perspective? I agree with what you were saying, but I've really been thinking a lot about how businesses can think about the communities and how they're embedded within a community as a way to become, protect themselves against the second wave. And so I'm thinking specifically of, I guess, 3 different levels. So one is with the local government, and making sure that they are in tune with what's happening at the local government and have relationships with their local representatives, because that allows them to have information as early as possible, as well as influence some of the decisions that are being made. And I have seen locally a difference in the organizations that have been more civic minded in the past, and how well they've been able to sort of predict and weather the storm with this first wave. And then the second is with small businesses. I've seen a few examples now locally of small businesses that have banded together, whether they already were part of a pre-existing consortium. So if they were part of, for example, a small restaurant group, or sometimes it's, I live in a small neighborhood in Boston, and some of the local businesses that are truly independent of each other have kind of banded up and are cross-promoting each other and helping each other, putting together service offerings that bring together both of their capabilities. And that's enabled them to be a lot more flexible in this time in terms of what they can offer customers. And then third is really just understanding the communities where they offer service, because that lets them make some good strategic decisions about how they want to change their business, pivot their business, and have that trust with their customers in addition to the trust with their employees. So I think really thinking broadly outside the organization into the context where they're embedded gives organizations some flexibility that they can leverage as this second wave hits us.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And, one of the projects that we've been doing is really going out and talking to leaders from different organizations as well, and trying to figure out like, what are some lessons from each of those individuals. And it was interesting because one of the ones that ARPI was actually focusing on recently was this idea that if we as organizations aren't, advocating for the industry, like it's, the idea of competition has to change, because, it's not like this one organization may or may not exist. It's like this whole industry might be just crippled. And so how do we reevaluate what competition even is when it comes to coming and being more resilient? And, I think it's going to be really exciting, because I think that's a big part of the conversation that we'll have on the event on the 17th of June, I believe. But yeah, I think that's really, really fabulous that you're talking about that, and how do you become more anti-fragile about being more invested in the community as well. So I think those are both really interesting sides of it. And so Warren, I'm going to throw over to you a different question. So there's a lot of conversation about using technology for contact tracing and how location tracking apps could become a mandatory part of the return to the workplace. In other industries that are more low tech solutions for keeping employees safe. So things like PPE, not accepting cash, and installing protective shields. So the question is, how can employers find the right solution for their particular situation? And what process would you recommend they use to make sure that these new measures are brought in a way that's respectful to the public health guidelines, their employee needs, and the customer's expectations?
Yeah, I think, certainly you're right. There's lots of different technologies that can be applied in different ways. Some of them simple, some of them more complex. But I think that the same rules apply that have always applied. You've got to start with understanding the experience that you're delivering, whether it's for your staff or for a customer, and then try and work back to the technologies that are going to be appropriate for that. If there's things that are sort of forced on folks, like or adopted through consensus, like a tracing app, something like that, then just have to look at, okay, well, if that's going to be the experience, how does that fit into the experience that you're offering today, and how can you maybe manage that or mitigate some of the friction that adds? Can you I think Amy and Russ were just talking about how maybe can you move some of the friction online, so you do you can do your testing survey at home before you go to work, or can you pay online early? Can you do things like that? Can you move the friction around so it's simpler? I think you have to start there. The other point on that was that I think there was a really great set of design principles by Lou Down from that used to be at the government digital service in the UK. And she had 13 principles for designing for a crisis, and I thought that's a really great place to start if you're thinking about how to integrate new technologies or new things into a customer experience or an employee experience. And it was really around focus on the safety, prioritize vulnerable people first, design for accessibility, so you're not putting things where people can't find them. That sort of stuff really changes how you approach doing things like that. And I would encourage anyone to take a look at that. There, just search Lou and you'll find them.
Fabulous. Okay. So I have two more questions, and then I do want to, if anyone who's listening in has any questions, I'd love to be able to get those answered as well. So please make sure to put them in the Q&A box or in the chat box if you already have it open. But before we get to that, a lot of business leaders we've been speaking to have been finding it very hard to understand how to protect their customers because the guidelines have been changing so rapidly, and just because a lot of them rely on other people along the supply chain and partners who may be in other jurisdictions. So how can businesses do what's right to protect their customers given this complex situation? Is anyone feeling particularly like they'd like to answer that one?
I mean, I don't have the answer. I recognize that there is a really tough dilemma for business owners who are, not doing well economically as a result in part of some of the safety measures that they're putting in place. And that's just such a devil's bargain. It's a really, really hard position to be in. But I think that one thing that should always be a guiding principle is to communicate clearly and authentically with your customers and with anyone else who's part of that conversation, so that they understand, first of all, you take it seriously, that you value their health, their safety, their well-being, and that they have some insight into the process, because that really does help to build trust. It shows respect for the people who you're in a relationship with. And it may not mean that you have exactly the right answer or the right solution in place, but at least you're giving people some, insight into what's behind the curtain, which I mean, it's the least you can do. And I think that because when all of this is over, part of what we're going to have to do is rebuild some of this social fabric, some of these relationships. It helps you come out at least in a good position for that piece of it.
Yeah, I'll second that. I think, in any period of forced innovation, which this is essentially what it is, if you're clear and transparent, you'll be given a lot of leeway by your employees, by your customers, if you're honest and transparent and saying we're trying this. Underlying that, safety first, those types of messages, that you're not doing anything to put anyone into danger. But no one's going to criticize you on the quality of the video that you put out right now. Nobody's going to question that your email came out quickly to address some sort of issue, had a spelling mistake in it. There's a lot of forgiveness right now for, I think, out there in terms of, as long as you are trying to get messages out quickly, that you're trying to address concerns, that you're open to hearing back from customers what their concerns are, and you're doing your best to address them. I think we're seeing a lot in the information work. We're hearing back from customer surveys and those kinds of things that we're doing as well, is that people don't be tone deaf. Obviously, it's not about selling things right now. They want to know how you're helping out. They understand that you're a business. They understand that you're trying to keep people employed. They also want to know how you're helping out. And I think it goes back to Amy's point, which was an excellent one, in terms of being connected to the community. And that community can be the local, it can be your state or provincial community, that you're participating in it, and that you're embracing the rules and looking to move forward. Where the ones that are not doing that right now, I think, are suffering a pretty big backlash on it. In that, if you look like you're just grabbing cash, then you're going to hear about it right now, and it's probably the end of your business.
Yeah, and I would just say too, the research on trust is very clear. It's far harder to regain lost trust than to maintain it or earn it in the first place. So, making those missteps where you're not being transparent, where you're doing something that ultimately ends up violating the social contract, that has a much heavier price than not doing the right thing, but being open and sort of authentic about that.
So better to make some mistakes, but be open about that you're trying.
I think it's a super important point there about engaging the staff, and Amy made that at the start, like engaging the staff and the customers and your leadership in that decision making. And there's a bunch that's been done really quickly on the crisis side of things, setting up crisis response teams in organizations and that kind of stuff, and they've done really great stuff really quickly. So the next step is to keep doing some of that good stuff, translate that into business as usual, and that does mean engaging people across teams, engaging customers, like keeping people informed. you know, and having people, you know, pull together to make the stuff that your organization is doing. You know, that's a really great way of building trust in your organization, also getting people engaged with the purpose of the organization as well.
That's great. So you've actually all answered my last question as well, which was really just going to be about, you know, it's going to be such a big impact on a business if cases do get traced back to it, especially during a second wave, and, you know, having to re-shut down and looking for ways to, you know, what can we do to make sure that we're instilling trust in our employees and our customers? And you've all had very, very beautifully worded ways of doing that. Do you have any sort of final thoughts on, you know, what businesses that maybe don't have large budgets or are struggling to get through this, what they can do to just make sure that they're instilling that trust so that they aren't losing it, or any kind of final thoughts or insights that you wanted to share?
I can maybe just chuck one thing out there. So, I mean, I think in British Columbia, I think we've been incredibly fortunate so far, and, you know, let's hope that continues. You know, the relatively few cases, and you know, coming out of it reasonably well. And I think everyone is a big fan of Bonnie Henry, who's been helping kind of steer the ship from a, you know, providing medical advice to people. But her sort of guiding principles were, I'm probably going to get these in the wrong order, but it was be kind, be calm, be safe. And I think, you know, it's starting from some core principles like that. It's just a really good way to guide the actions of your organization, whatever size it is, because, you know, if you're starting from that, you're probably going to make some good decisions, whether there's specific guidelines or budgets there. You know, try and start from that core and start from things that align to your purpose, and build out from there. You won't go far wrong, I think.
Great.
I love where you're going with the alignment with purpose. I just wanted to say, I think that's a really great point.
Yeah, and I think it's understanding who the trusted voices in your community are right now too, in terms of, it's interesting, the BC health minister, I'm not sure of her title, but in Alberta, it's Dina Hinshaw is the chief medical officer for Alberta. She's far more trusted than politicians right now. And it's because they're giving really good advice, and it's good advice to individuals and good advice to businesses. I do think people will, if you're following those best practices, if you're doing your very best and you are being very clear and transparent in doing that, people will be understanding that you've done everything within reason to take the matter seriously and take the safety of your employees and customers seriously. If something should go wrong, and you're open and quick to react to it, I don't know that it's the end of your business forever. If you don't do any of those steps, though, then if it comes through that you didn't do things like that, then you will probably pay a very heavy price. So the best thing we can all do is do exactly that, is follow advice of experts, health experts that we're getting from government. There's lots of resources out there. Salesforce put out a site called work.com, which is absolutely phenomenal, if not a little scary, and how overwhelming it is in terms of helping businesses go back to work, both, of course, using their products, but also just generally good advice and such. So there are lots of different resources out there, depending on the size of your business, from the small to the very large, to tap into.
Yeah, fabulous. Thank you so much. I don't see any questions in this exact moment. So I'm going to take, while people, if they have any last questions they want to ask, I'm actually going to ask a question of my own, if that's okay for you. Is I'd love to know, and you all live in different cities, so you might all have a different perspective, or maybe one of you wants to kind of answer this one. What is your feeling on transit and rebuilding trust when it comes to public mobility and safety in space?
I live in a city where trust in that system was low going into this. So I'm looking forward to a lot of walking. Yeah, I think in Boston it's really going to be an uphill battle because our transit system has been beleaguered for a while. You know, it's underfunded. It's not really well maintained, and you know, I think that they're going to have to do a special lot of work in order to make people feel safe, including, you know, really visible cleaning procedures, which is something that has been lacking to my understanding.
Yeah.
I think any form of public transit from the bus or subway or whatever it may be to airplanes. I travel a lot for what I do. Most of my clients are in the US. And that's all under duress right now. I don't know that I'm going to jump on a plane anytime soon. And there's a good example of Brandon United telling people that they would separate people, and then pictures where they weren't separating them. So that means my trust is gone for a little while. To ride shares, I go to the Bay Area quite a bit for what I do, and Uber and Lyft are the means of getting around town, and I don't know that I want to jump in the back of a car right now with a stranger. So I think those are going to be businesses that both the public and private elements of those are going to be slow to regain trust of people. That said, I also recognize my own privilege in that I can do my job digitally. I don't have to do it. I certainly recognize that there are many people that rely on that in order to earn a paycheck, and that's going to be a difficult thing to navigate.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's an interesting one as well, as far as, you know, how complex of an ecosystem that a city is. You know, when you look at Boston, look at Vancouver, you look at smaller towns that don't even have a good transit service. So the impacts of on the transit experience is going to be. But there's a lot to that, and a lot of impacts in that, and there's going to be a lot of incentives to make it right, as you know, as sort of right as it can be. I think one of the things that's been really neat to see in Vancouver is the opening up of streets for, you know, to help people physical distance. So they're taking the cars off the streets and making them more accessible to bikes and pedestrians. And you know, I see that as being replicated and happening in lots of different cities, lots of different areas. And so I think the increase in you know, walking and cycling, I think it has a lot of positive effects where that's possible, and potentially that could include scooters and other forms of you know, other forms of transportation that may augment things like buses and trains and those types of things, which are going to have less people on if we're going to distance. So again, it's a complicated mash of things, but I think the key thing is for the organisations that are operating those things, you know, nationally need to pull together and create some kind of coherent strategy for how these things are going to come back, and I think they are. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see what's going to happen there.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Amy, to your point about, you know, maybe it's even just as simple as having people visibly doing cleaning, or, you know, things like that, where it just is, you know, it's more about showing than telling, and just living the truth of their values. Thank you, everybody. So we're kind of at time, but if anyone does have any other questions, maybe just super quickly, one at a time, what is one social handle that you would encourage people to post, tweet, message you at if they have any other questions? Amy.
I'm on Twitter at AmyB,
Perfect. All right, Warren.
WJ Anthony at Twitter.
Perfect. Russ.
I am Rickey, Rickey on Twitter as well.
Perfect. Thank you, all of you, so much. This has been so great. I am now just going to quickly share my screen again and just remind everybody about the shares. Thank you so much, everybody. Just as a super quick reminder, next Wednesday, we have another event coming up about how COVID is changing education, addressing the CX and EX challenges. June 3rd, we're talking about how tourism and hospitality need to adapt to the needs of visitors. On June 17th, we're talking about how organizations become adaptive and resilient in a time of crisis. And then at some point, probably towards the end of June, we're going to be talking about how charities need to meet the needs of donors in a time of crisis. And also, just really quickly to invite everybody as well, is this Friday, as well as every Friday following each of these events, we will be doing a working session. So it'll be a much shorter working session at 1 p.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Eastern time, where you can come and we'll discuss some of the things that we've learned during these sessions. And then, yeah, just have some really great, robust conversations where you'll actually be involved in that. So participation is limited. Please, go on to Eventbrite. Art actually just posted for everybody there the tickets for that, so you can make sure that you register. And then also we will be sharing the recording from today with everybody as well. So thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully we will see you at some of these other events, and some of you on Friday as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks all.